"Sir, the lounge is for real customers only," the receptionist snapped, her tone sharp, as if dismissing the very notion that Howard might belong. Howard, a man of 75, sat silently in the corner of the bustling showroom. He had come for one reason, and one reason alone, to purchase a reliable car. But no one noticed him. Not the sleek salespeople whose polished shoes clicked across the floor, nor the men lounging in designer suits, oblivious to the world outside their insulated bubble. How often do we pass by unnoticed? How many times have we dismissed someone based on appearances alone? These are questions we might ask ourselves when confronted with stories like Howard's. The answers are unsettling. Howard had served in the Army Signal Corps during the Vietnam War, where his work had kept the lines of communication open when everything else seemed to be breaking down. Since retiring, he'd lived quietly, away from the noise of the world. He repaired radios and helped younger veterans navigate the maze of benefits they'd earned. Yet today, dressed in his simplest clothes, an old flannel shirt and scuffed boots, he had entered the showroom, hoping to find something reliable to help him with his doctor's appointments. But what he found instead was a wall of indifference. He sat still, folding his weathered hands, waiting, the kind of patience only veterans understand. A man who had been trained to endure the silence and the waiting, even when no one cared to ask his story, even when no one cared at all. As the minutes ticked by, Howard's mind wandered to old memories, to a time when he was part of something that mattered, a time when the world noticed him. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, well-worn notebook. The pages, yellowed with age, contained the notes he'd written in those intense life-or-death moments on the battlefield. Call signs, radio frequencies, diagrams of antenna positions, details that could save lives. The sound of the showroom faded around him, and for a moment, he was back in Vietnam, still waiting for the signal to go through. But here, in this showroom, his presence went unnoticed, just as it had for the last 40 minutes. A young receptionist with perfectly manicured nails and a flawless hairstyle finally noticed Howard. She approached, her expression uninviting. "This area is for customers, sir," she said, her tone carrying the weight of judgment, as if Howard's very presence had interrupted the pristine environment she was overseeing. Howard's voice, steady and calm, responded, "I'm here to buy a car." His hands, calloused from years of work, rested gently on his knees, betraying nothing of the life he had lived or the sacrifices he had made. She looked him up and down, her eyes lingering on his modest attire, then shrugged dismissively. "Then, someone will help you. Eventually," she added, as if his visit were just another nuisance to be dealt with. Time crawled forward. 40 minutes passed in uncomfortable silence. Howard remained seated, his back straight, his patience unwavering. It was how he had been trained in the military, not to demand, not to complain, but to wait. He had learned long ago that the world did not always work in his favor, and it had certainly not been kind today. Inside his wallet, an old photograph had been tucked for years, a black and white image of Howard and his comrades from Vietnam. It was worn and frayed at the edges, a relic of a time when he was part of something larger than himself. No one ever asked about that story, about the sacrifices made, about the times lives hung in the balance, and Howard had been the one to make sure communication lines stayed open. As the minutes ticked by, the salespeople continued their conversations, oblivious to Howard's quiet presence. The receptionist returned to her desk, her fingers tapping away at the keyboard, oblivious to the weight of history and sacrifice standing just a few feet away. The faint murmur of voices behind the glass. Partition grew louder, but to Howard it felt like a distant hum, just noise. Just background to a life that had long been ignored. In the corner, one salesman whispered to another, "Look at him. Probably just here for the free coffee, right? No chance he can afford a car like the ones we're selling." Another laughed and added, "He probably doesn't even have a driver's license anymore." The receptionist rolled her eyes as she joined the group. We get these types sometimes. They wander in, looking lost, and leave when they realize no one's giving out handouts. Howard didn't flinch. He didn't react. The judgment of others had become a background noise in his life, something he had learned to block out over the years. But that didn't mean it didn't sting. He folded his hands, returning his attention to his notebook, to the world he could control, to the world where every signal mattered. Outside the showroom, a younger salesman named Greg stood near the service bay, watching through the large glass windows. There was something about the situation that didn't sit right with him. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something inside him stirred. "Are you sure he's not here to buy something?" Greg asked, approaching the sales manager inside the showroom. He glanced back at Howard, still sitting in the corner, waiting quietly. The sales manager scoffed, adjusting his tie as he gave a dismissive glance toward Howard.
"Trust me, Greg, I've been in this game for over 20 years. You don't make commission off charity cases. He's not worth your time." His words were cold, dismissing Howard as nothing more than an inconvenience, a ghost of a man who didn't belong in the showroom. Greg wasn't convinced.
He couldn't explain why, but something about the man's presence nagged at him. As he walked back inside to retrieve a clipboard, he shot a glance at Howard, who was now sitting even more quietly, absorbed in his sketchbook. Howard's hands moved slowly, methodically, as he drew small diagrams, intricate sketches of antenna positions, call signs, and careful measurements. In the corner of the page, there was a quote from his commander, Major Thomas Dent. "No voice unheard, no signal lost." The noise of the showroom, the chatter of salesmen, the ringing phones, and the whirring coffee machines all faded into the background. For Greg, the silence around Howard seemed to grow, drawing Greg's attention. For a moment, it was as though Howard wasn't just an old man sitting in a dealership. He was a man with a history, a story that needed to be told. Just as Greg stood there in contemplation, a sleek black SUV pulled into the lot, its polished surface reflecting the midday sun. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a perfectly tailored suit, his posture commanding attention. It was Major Thomas Dent, now Colonel Dent, retired and successful in business, the former commander who had led Howard and many others in Vietnam. Major Dent surveyed the showroom with a sharp gaze that immediately found Howard sitting in his corner. "Sergeant Howard Kent," Dent's voice rang out, clear and authoritative, carrying the weight of respect and recognition. All eyes in the showroom turned toward the man who had waited quietly for over an hour, the man everyone had ignored. Howard stood slowly, his movements deliberate, as if he were already prepared for this moment, even though it was unexpected. The air shifted, and for the first time, the room seemed to notice him. "You're a hard man to find," Dent said, walking toward Howard and pulling him into an embrace. "It's good to see you, Sergeant." The receptionist, who had once dismissed Howard so callously, stood frozen at her desk, her hands hovering over the keyboard as she watched the scene unfold. Do you know him?" she stammered, her voice betraying both confusion and a growing sense of guilt. Dent's eyes narrowed, his gaze turning cold as he responded, "Know him? This man saved my life twice. Once with his radio when our position was about to be overrun, and once by dragging me half a mile with a bullet in his shoulder." The receptionist's mouth hung open in disbelief. It was clear now that Howard's story was one that had never been told, and one that had been hidden beneath the layers of judgment and dismissiveness from the very people who should have known better. The sales manager, sensing the shift in the room, stepped forward, attempting to salvage some semblance of professionalism. "Sir, we had no idea," he began, his voice faltering under the weight of Dent's sharp gaze. Dent cut him off with a simple yet forceful reply, "That, my friend, is precisely the problem." The room went silent, every employee frozen in place. The weight of dense words hung heavy in the air, each syllable carrying the sting of a hard truth. The showroom, once filled with the hum of sales pitches and coffee machine whirs, was now a place of uneasy quiet. It was as though the world had shifted, and everyone was now faced with a reality they had been too blind to see. You all saw an old man in modest clothes, and you decided his story wasn't worth knowing. Dent continued, his voice calm but firm. That man right there, he gestured to Howard, who was still standing with quiet dignity, is a hero. And you judged him based on his appearance, as if that was all there was to him. But appearances don't tell the story. They never do. The foyer. General Manager, who had just emerged from his office, stood frozen in the doorway, his face paling as the realization of what had just unfolded hit him. Dent turned to him, his expression hardening as he addressed the manager directly. Is this how you treat veterans? Dent's voice was low, but carried an undeniable weight. The manager, caught off guard, mumbled, "We didn't know he was a veteran." Dent raised a hand, cutting him off. But you didn't ask either, did you? You didn't take the time to learn his story. You didn't take the time to treat him like a person, like someone whose sacrifices made it possible for you to sit in your comfortable office. The air in the showroom grew thick with shame. The silence felt unbearable, the weight of their collective ignorance pressing down on them. Howard stood still, his expression unreadable, as the world around him seemed to crumble layer by layer. The sales staff, who had once mocked him, now avoided his gaze, unable to confront the ugliness of their own assumptions. Dent pulled out his phone and made a quick call, his tone short and professional. "Yes, it's done. I'll handle them. Details later," he said, hanging up before turning to Howard. "Don't worry, Sergeant. This is about to be sorted." Within minutes, 2 men in expensive suits entered the dealership, their presence immediately felt. They approached the general manager, speaking in hushed tones as the manager's color drained from his face. The tension in the air was palpable, as everyone in the showroom stood on edge, unsure of what was happening, but sensing that the tide was turning. After a brief exchange, Dent stood, his posture commanding the room's attention once more. "For those of you wondering what just happened," he began, his voice carrying authority, "I've purchased a majority stake in this dealership. Effective immediately, I'm the new owner." The words echoed through the showroom, causing the staff to gasp collectively. Shock rippled through the room, and the sales manager's coffee mug slipped from his hands, shattering on the floor, the noise underscoring the moment of reckoning. Dent turned to face the stunned staff, his eyes locking with each one of them. "First order of business," he continued, his voice steady and strong. "Howard gets any car on this lot. No payments, no paperwork, whatever he wants." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in. "It's the least we can do for a man who kept countless soldiers alive with his communication skills." Dent's gaze softened as he looked at Howard, who stood quietly, still processing the events unfolding around him. "Second," Dent continued, his voice hardening once again, "everyone here gets retrained on how to treat customers, all customers, with dignity and respect, or they'll be replaced, starting today." His words hung in the air like a clear directive, unambiguous and unyielding. Greg, the young salesman who had questioned his colleagues earlier, stepped forward, his voice tentative, but filled with sincerity. "Sir, if it's all right with everyone, I'd be honored to help Mr. Kent find exactly what he needs." Howard, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Then let's do it together, son." The words were simple, but they carried with them the weight of an unspoken bond, a respect that had been earned not by appearances, but by actions. As the two walked toward the used car section, the whispers from the remaining staff followed them, but Howard and Greg were no longer concerned with them. In the back of the showroom, the sales manager, still reeling from the shock, turned to the others. "This is going to change everything, isn't it?" he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. But no one answered. They were all too absorbed in their own thoughts. the reality of what had just transpired sinking in, slowly, but surely. As Greg and Howard made their way through the used car section, a quiet calm settled over the showroom. The previous tension had given way to a new sense of purpose. For the first time that day, the showroom felt less like a sales floor and more like a place where decisions mattered, not just transactions, but lives. Greg led Howard through the rows of cars, his steps tentative at first, unsure of how to approach the situation. But the weight of Dent's words, the abrupt shift in the dealership's power dynamics, had given him a newfound sense of responsibility. He had seen the dismissiveness in his colleagues' eyes, the way they had reduced Howard to nothing more than an old man in outdated clothes. But now, standing alongside Howard, he understood the depth of the mistake they had all made. He wasn't just helping a customer. He was helping a man who had once saved lives, a man whose worth went far beyond the surface. "Here's one," Greg said, his voice quieter now, as he gestured toward a reliable mid-sized sedan. "It's not fancy, but it's solid. Good mileage. Low maintenance." Howard stopped, running a hand over the sleek surface of the car, his fingers tracing the lines as if feeling the vehicle's history. His face, weathered by time and experience, softened for a moment. "It'll do," he said, his voice gentle but firm, the simplicity of his words speaking volumes. Greg nodded, offering a small smile. "I'll make sure it's ready for you. No charge, of course." As they walked back toward the front, the atmosphere of the dealership had shifted once again. No longer was it filled with the cold, transactional air of a place driven by quotas and profit margins. It now held the warmth of redemption, of second chances, of a company ready to correct its wrongs. The employees who had been standing in stunned silence moments earlier were now buzzing with a different energy. They could sense the change in the air, the new direction that was being set, and while some of them were still processing the magnitude of what had happened, others were already beginning to accept the challenge of transformation. Back in the showroom, Dent stood by the front desk, his eyes scanning the room. The old sign above the receptionist's desk, which had once advertised the dealership's name with bold, sterile letters, was now being replaced with a new one. The words, "Kent and Dent Motors, built on brotherhood," were being carefully painted onto the glass. It was a fitting tribute to the bond that had been forged in the unlikeliest of places. Dent turned as Howard approached, his new car keys in hand. He smiled, a look of quiet satisfaction in his eyes. "You know, I never thought I'd be running a dealership either," he said with a chuckle. "But some partnerships are meant to last." Howard nodded, his eyes meeting Dent's. "I never. Thought I'd be back in the fight, but here I am." Dent clapped him gently on the shoulder. "And here you'll stay, Sergeant. Here, you'll always be welcome." As Howard took a seat near the now abandoned coffee machine, he noticed a few of the salespeople glance at him, some with embarrassment, others with newfound respect. One of the younger salesmen, a man who had earlier made a joke at Howard's expense, approached with a hesitant smile. "Mr. Kent," the salesman said, his voice different now, softer. I just wanted to say thank you for your service. We didn't know, but that's no excuse." He extended his hand. Howard looked at the outstretched hand for a moment before shaking it firmly. "No harm done, son. Just remember, it's not about what you see on the outside. Never has been." The salesman nodded, looking down at his shoes. "I won't forget," he said quietly. And just like that, something shifted. The atmosphere of the dealership was different. Not just in the physical sense, but in the hearts and minds of the people who worked there. Howard had reminded them of something they had lost sight of: the importance of respecting the dignity of every person, no matter their age, appearance, or station in life. As the day wore on, the dealership continued its business. But now, there was an undercurrent of something more profound, a sense of responsibility to honor the veterans who had given so much for the freedoms they took for granted. No longer would they be dismissed as old men in the waiting area or overlooked as charity cases. Every veteran who walked through the door would be greeted with respect and gratitude. as it should have always been. By the time Howard left, the sun had dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the lot. The new sign above the entrance gleamed in the fading light, a symbol of the change that had taken place. As he climbed into his new car, Howard paused for a moment, looking at the dealership through the rearview mirror. It was no longer the same place he had walked into that morning, feeling invisible. It was now a place where his worth was acknowledged, where his sacrifices had been recognized. He smiled softly, the weight of the day finally settling in. The battle had been hard, but in the end, he had won not just a car, but the respect he had earned long ago. The next morning, the sun had barely risen when Howard drove back to the dealership, the faint hum of the engine accompanying him like a steady reminder of the journey he had been on. The streets were still quiet, the air crisp with the promise of a new day. But inside the dealership, everything had changed. As Howard approached the entrance, he could already see the new sign gleaming in the morning light. Kent and Dent Motors, built on brotherhood. It was a quiet yet powerful statement of everything that had shifted in the past 24 hours. What had once been a place of judgment, indifference, and missed opportunities had now transformed into something far more meaningful. The dealership now had a new energy to it, a sense of purpose, a renewed commitment to values that transcended the bottom line. Howard parked his car in the same spot he had the day before, the spot where he had first walked in, feeling invisible. As he stepped out of the car, he saw that the staff had already arrived and were gathering by the front desk, all standing, a little taller, a little more aware of the role they played in the lives of those who walked through their doors. Greg, the young salesman who had shown Howard such kindness, stepped forward first. His smile was genuine, not the forced, sales-driven one from the day before, but one born of respect and understanding. "Good morning, Mr. Kent," he said, his voice warm. "I made sure your truck's all ready to go. We also made sure to install the flag decal you wanted." Howard's eyes softened as he looked at Greg. "Thank you, son. It's good to see someone who gets it." "Of course," Greg replied. "It's the least we could do." As Howard walked toward the coffee machine, he noticed the receptionist, the same woman who had barely acknowledged him the day before, was now seated at a different desk, a trainee in customer relations. Her posture was straighter, her expression softer, and there was a hint of something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Good morning, Mr. Kent," she said quietly as he passed by. "I just wanted to apologize for the way I treated you yesterday. I didn't know. I should have shown more respect." Howard paused for a moment, looking at her. There was no trace of sarcasm or dismissiveness in her voice anymore. "It's all right," he said, his voice steady. "You didn't know, but you do now." The receptionist nodded, her eyes a little downcast. "Thank you for your understanding." As Howard made his way toward the service area, he saw a few new faces, other veterans who had come to the dealership, having heard about the changes that had taken place. They looked at Howard with a mixture of admiration and gratitude, recognizing him not just as a customer, but as a symbol of something greater. One young man, dressed in a military jacket that had seen better days, approached him. "Mr. Kent?" the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just wanted to thank you for everything. I saw the story online. I didn't know what it was like for people like you. But now I see. Thank you for your service, both in the past and today." Howard placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, his eyes softening. "No voice unheard," he murmured, the words as much for himself as for the man before him. "It's not about recognition. It's about making sure people remember. People like us. We've earned the right to be heard." The young man nodded, his eyes bright with a mixture of respect and understanding. Howard turned, walking past the service bay where Dent was talking to a group of investors, ensuring the future of the dealership was secured. Dent caught Howard's eye, giving him a small nod of acknowledgement. The partnership had already started to evolve into something even more powerful than just business. It was about legacy. As Howard stood outside, looking at the new sign one last time, he realized that the story of the dealership had become part of his own story. The same dealership that had once ignored him, dismissed him as irrelevant, had now become a place where veterans, no matter their age or appearance, were given the respect they deserved. It wasn't just about the cars anymore. It was about the people who came in, people who had sacrificed and given so much. Howard's hand rested on the steering wheel of his new truck, his mind wandering back to the days of his service, the moments of quiet desperation, the long hours waiting for a signal that might never come. He had spent so much of his life waiting, silently carrying the weight of a history that no one seemed to remember. But now he understood something. There were places in this world where voices were finally heard, where stories were finally told, and this dealership, Kent and Dent Motors, was one of those places. Howard took a deep breath, his gaze steady as he looked out at the road ahead. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it had just begun. The dealership doors closed behind him, but the legacy they had built would never be forgotten.